Today's webinar, Building Open Data Ecosystems, brings civic innovation to the core of governance. I'm Elena Gasol Ramos, and I'm in the ICT unit at the bank, and I've been working on open innovation ecosystems for the last couple of years. This webinar is part of our series on smart cities that is jointly organized by the ICT practice and the urban practice at the World Bank. This series will facilitate dialogues on how cities can make use of data and technology and improve city planning, management, and service delivery, engage citizens, and enhance accountability, what we normally think of as a smart city. Speakers today will share their experiences on how to address the widening gap between the public and private sectors in their effective use of technology and design. They will focus on building a civic technology capacity within societies and partnership with local governments, and especially talk about their experiences in Africa and the Caribbean. We are pleased to have Matthew McNaughton and Justin Arnstein with us today. Let me briefly introduce them. Matthew is an open innovation and development specialist at the World Bank and a co-founder of the /Roots Foundation. The /Roots Foundation is a civic tech non-profit building technology in communities to address development issues in the Caribbean, all across the Caribbean. Justin works with partners across Africa to kickstart the open data movement and help strengthen investigative reporting and media adoption of new technologies and business models. Arnstein is the co-founder of Code for Africa and runs citizen labs in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, which embeds technologies into newsrooms and other social justice organizations. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Matthew for his presentation. Matthew?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are across the world. Sorry, just kind of getting oriented here. Thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to talk a little bit, and thank you for Elena for inviting me and to the team for organizing this seminar. I'm going to talk a little, quite briefly today, about open data ecosystems in the Caribbean, and particularly around alignment with the idea of building, using open data, but alignment with that and service delivery. The Caribbean itself has had historically quite a strong relationship with freedom of information and freedom of the press, and in particular, that aspect of the open government and open data ecosystem, when we started our work, was not necessarily a strong draw for a lot of agencies that we engaged with. I think many were far more interested in looking and thinking about, well, how does this connect with service delivery? How does this help us better connect, serve our citizens? How does this lead to economic development? How does this lead to growth? And from our standpoint, those things were things that we also thought were strong to, very important to focus on as well, as we wanted to make this sustainable as a movement in the region. So let's start with a quick introduction. So as Elena mentioned, I work also help found an organization called the /Roots Foundation. And as she mentioned, we work with governments and civil society and the broader tech community in the Caribbean to both build the capacity of the region and kind of the tech ecosystem there, but then also thinking about ways how can we apply that capacity to addressing development issues endemic to the region. And one of the other things that we do as an initiative is a conference called Developing the Caribbean. It's a 2-day open data conference and code sprint that focuses on open data, civic tech, how different organizations and entities are using technology innovatively in the region. And we hold it simultaneously across multiple islands. Anyone who's familiar with the region knows that there are lots of, it's very diverse region with lots of different islands, lots of different culture, food, and all these things. And so we wanted the event to really be a celebration of that. And so we hosted simultaneously across the region. Last year when we had the event, we did it in Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago. And all of those local organizers worked to host events and conferences where there are different presentations highlighting work, as well as um, you know, developer competitions where technologists got together with government agencies to build, um, address development issues in new ways. We've been doing DevCo for the last 3 years. But in one of the challenges with DevCon, one of the things that as we did DevCon more and more was that it was great for raising awareness around open data, engaging a broad group of stakeholders around the concepts, but it wasn't necessarily good for sustaining the impact and engagement that was necessary for facilitating the culture change that a lot of persons were starting to get interested in. And so, for a lot of different persons, that when they think about the region, they think about beaches, they think about, reggae music, they think about good food. And for the most part, that is the Caribbean. But at the same time, the Caribbean is also a region that's struggling in a lot of different ways. And many of the islands in the Caribbean suffer from low growth, huge budget deficits, and significant unemployment, particularly in youth. And in Jamaica, which is one of the worst hit islands in the region, we have a debt to GDP ratio of over 140%. And to put that in relation, a couple of years ago when a lot of discussion was going on in the US around this, was the US comparative is about 10%. And so what does that really mean is that when we look at the budget, and that the image that you guys are looking at there is a visualization of the 2011-2012 budget, or 2012-2013 budget in Jamaica. We spend more on budget and debt servicing than we do on healthcare and education combined. And Jamaica isn't unique in being in this situation. And so when we talk about this idea of open data, and we talk about this idea of building an ecosystem in our context and a lot of the context in the region, what we mean is how do we, one, open up the challenges that exist in the region for more people to participate and for more people to contribute, but then also really align that with solving real core service delivery challenges that constrain us in the region. And so in the transition from DevCo to thinking about this initiative, which one of the initiatives that we started called Code for the Caribbean, we were thinking of, how do we move from more than just a hackathon? How do we create sustainable work? How do we create sustainable engagement with different partners that lead to impactful engagement? And then also, how do we work not just outside of government, also within government and with government agencies? And so that discussion really started with one agency, in our case, one agency in Jamaica called RADA, which stands for the Rural Agricultural Development Authority. And RADA is an agency of the Ministry of Agriculture, and really they sit at the forefront of agricultural service delivery in Jamaica. They manage extension services. They're the ones who interact with the farmers, and they're really the ministry's connection to the ground. And while RADA, relatively speaking, is actually one of the more innovative agriculture agencies in the region, they too also have their challenges. There are about 150 extension officers in Jamaica, serving about 800,000 farmers. It doesn't scale, and what that leads to, and also when you look at the public discourse around some of the challenges that leads to, it really, often portrays RADA as a failing agency in that they're struggling to really bear fruit in an industry that is quite important in Jamaica. One of the biggest problems that face RADA as an agency is this issue of predial larceny. Predial larceny is, for my friends from America, they often talk about it as being cattle wrangling, which is the theft of agricultural produce and livestock. And predial larceny robs the agricultural industry in Jamaica of about 50 million US dollars per annum, which is quite significant, for an island of Jamaica's size. And what that really does is that it ruins livelihoods, it creates mistrust in communities, and it disincentivizes investment in a sector that employs almost 20% of the population in Jamaica. And so when we think about open data, and we think about these service delivery challenges, and we think about this context of predial larceny, these are real issues that affect the public in Jamaica that we were working with Rada around to address. So I'll just kind of walk through kind of, well, how do we move from, okay, so we have a willing partner, you know, we have a citizen facing problem that we want to focus on. And so how do we kind of move to working to have some impact on that? And so in thinking about, within the context of building that broader ecosystem, we brought a number of different partners to bear on that problem space. And that was kind of one of the benefits of kind of creating this initiative, the Code for the Caribbean initiative that we started, working with the School of Business in Jamaica. The work was supported by the IDRC out of Canada. We brought other kind of social impact organizations like Reboots, that is a design firm based out of New York. There's a regional coalition of partners working on open data that founded the Caribbean Open Institute. And then also, the region, one of the first partners for Code for America. And so looking at all these different partners coming together, contributing in different ways, to thinking about how do we, what does the ecosystem around open data look like in the region, and how do each of, bring all of them to bear on this problem space. And so we had this network of partners. We now go to, well, how do we build a team, the fellows that are going to be working on this. And so we put out a call for fellows, over a very short period, about 3 weeks, had a number of partners, and we brought these fellows together. Rory and Station, who are on the left of the picture, Varun on the left, Rory and Station on the right, Varun on the left, who is the engineering resident, a part of the Sashroots team, and Afifa, who is the program manager. This is one of the pictures from them out in one of the farms should have been on one of the farms, but one of the larger farms in Jamaica, from some of the research that they were doing. But when you think about this ecosystem and some of the environments that we work in, even though civic tech is very much a global movement, the nuance varies. And so even though, there are lots of people in Jamaica and the Caribbean that are frustrated by, the ways that some things don't work, and they want to contribute and they want to volunteer, we also have to think about in the context that there's not a lot of opportunity in the region. And many people also see this, that they want to participate, but they also have to figure out, well, how do they make ends meet? How do they create sustainable livelihoods for themselves? And, whereas in, the US or other places, volunteerism and kind of giving off the free time to do some of those things is a lot easier to do. That's a consideration that we have to think about in the region as well. And one of the things that we heard the fellows talk about and different persons, a part of our community, talk about. So, even though we weren't necessarily able to pay them full market rates, we found other ways to kind of, create value through the experience of the fellowship. We organized a workshop with both for the government partner as well as for other persons from the Prada Larson ecosystem with the D School, which was something that to kind of introduce a new language, a new approach to service delivery in the region. And then we also brought some of these other partners that are very much kind of leaders in the open government, open data space to kind of share experiences and training around, ethnography, around service design, around open data, building APIs. That was both a benefit for the fellows as well as for the government partners. And that process of learning together that we saw was really useful for creating trust, but also kind of creating camaraderie between the partners involved. And then also a workspace that was different from what most persons traditionally work within the region was one of the things that was a strength of the experience that we were creating. And so what did that lead to? One of the key things that we kind of engaged with and kind of leveraged through the experience was helping and working with the government agents to try a different approach to thinking about service delivery. The traditional approach within government is thinking about creating a request for proposals, which assumes that you know exactly what you want when you start. You choose your vendor, then you go through this process of creating a solution that in 2 years or whenever that solution is created is supposed to solve a problem that you knew exactly everything about 2 years before, which we've seen doesn't always work. And so we said, well, let's turn that process on its head and let's really talk with the people that we're trying to serve. Let's have them involved in the design process, and then let's, you know, create small investments in prototypes that we increasingly spend more time and more resources on based on whether they're working or not. And so going through that process of interviews, learning lessons, rapid prototyping, and demo and testing was really the approach we took through the fellowship program. And that was very different to the traditional service design approach. Okay. And so so what came out of that? There were two things that came out of that fellowship experience. On the first instance was Harvest, which was a platform for sharing agricultural data within government, but also with the public. And then Clip, which was a SMS service for accessing information by police officers in the field. By police officers. So one of the interactions that we focused on is that when one of the communities we looked in, the police officers were, because creating larceny itself is touches a lot of different areas, and kind of the police's ability to make a decision call in the field was one of the interactions that we saw in one parish had led to really strong improvements around deterrence to being able to catch creative larceny. And so we worked with them. That was one of the interactions that we did, that we said we could really look at this positive deviant that had been happening to really support and scale that up. That was one of the things that we did, but then there are some other things that the agency is now using Harvest to do in terms of supporting data collection. Because when you look at the ecosystem around the problem of predial larceny, it's all of these different agencies that touch the problem in different ways. There's a government, there's a community. Within the community, there are the farms, there's the markets. There are all these different agencies. So Harvest really allowed us to break down those data silos that allow those different agencies to participate. And so just kind of in closing and talking about the role of open data and kind of in thinking about some of these things and also the work that was done, often when we talk about open data, it's separate and apart from how government works. And it's this thing that government is going to open up this information and make it available. But, within any government agency, and as we found out in the agriculture space, there's this idea of this service delivery value chain, where you have these different actors providing, information or services at the different points. And parallel to that, there's often a data value chain, which is information that supports the different actors. Government is very good at collecting reports, generating reports. But the relationship between the data that supports decision making and the services that are being provided is often not a very closely paired one, and there's frequently a lot of friction. And what that results is that most cases we don't talk about government as being data driven. And so in this case, the approach that we took was looking at and thinking about, well, how does for technology and for open government to be sustainable, it really needs to be aligned with the day-to-day operations of the organizations that are providing those services. And we can't think of open data as being separate from something that government is doing. And that really was fundamental to how the approach that we took and how we kind of integrated the idea of the open data into how the agency was working. And so it wasn't something that was separate. Other aspects of the fellowship program that were really useful was that, it's important that all of those experiences around the training, the experiences in the field, really created a relationship of trust that allowed us to have honest conversations about what was working or what wasn't working. Technology was at the core of our value proposition, even though we were trying to change the way approach to thinking about service design. But a key aspect of that was technology. And for persons who are thinking about doing this work in other places, think about your sustainability model from early, because those differ. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I'll give now the word to Justin. For everybody, please hold your questions until the end, and we'll have then the opportunity to have a discussion with both Justin and Matthew. Thank you very much. Justin?
Thanks very much. So just while my presentation's loading, I've also posted in the chat panel, I've just posted a link to the online version of my presentation, and that includes all of the links to the projects that I'm going to speak about. So like Matthew, I'm with an organization that tries to act across a number of countries. So I'm with something called CfAfrica, and we operate across the continent at the moment, helping to drive open data, but more importantly, helping citizens to engage both with their governments, but also with the corporate sector and the civil society sector. These are the people who shape the physical lives of ordinary citizens, and that we seldom have links to shape how they interact with us or the services that they deliver to us. So what we've done is, although we're a civic organization, we've thought long and hard about what civic means. And in the US and in Europe, a lot of the civic movements that we see are very top-down, very supply-driven. And what that means is that they try and work with government agencies to try and streamline and improve government services delivered to citizens. We're slightly different. We try and work bottom-up. We try and rather address the demand side of the ecosystem. And what that means is that we try and find out what citizens need in their lives, and specifically from governments, and then try and improve the way that they can shape those services or demand those services. So there's a link on my presentation to the organization's website, which gives you an idea of some of the activities and programs. In all, we support currently over 90 active projects across Africa. And they range from your traditional data projects to things like citizen drones, which are collecting information on pollution, sensors that we've embedded in rivers to help warn people against waterborne diseases, and then a lot of citizen reporting apps and your more traditional kind of forensic data analysis projects. All of these project support are open source, and they're available for reuse, both the code and the data, online. The previous slide had a link to the Umbrella Code for Africa code repository. This slide has a link to the Code for South Africa repository. We've got code for movements currently in 4 different countries, in 4 stages of development, some more mature than others. The Code for South Africa project is one that I'm probably going to be highlighting most, because they're the country office that is focusing most on city kind of level engagements and solutions. So having 90 projects and having engineering teams and having lots of data is all fantastic, but it doesn't really mean anything unless you understand the local context and unless you design in response to that local context. So this is a picture of a medical records library or room in Nigeria. And this is not just Nigeria, this is a very kind of accurate reflection of many of the countries where we operate and the state of public records and what we call data. So a lot of the challenges that we face is, how do we take something like this and turn it into useful information that people can use and access on smartphones or on SMS or on other electronic devices. And knowing how to do that means knowing the local partners. So what I want to do is, rather than speak about the theory, is just to show you a couple of very quick examples of how we've done this using not very much money for the prototyping. So we use a very similar approach to what you heard Matthew speak about, which is find public needs, iterate and do prototypes as often as possible, as low cost and as fast as possible, to find something that works really well, and then invest a lot of effort into expanding that into something that can scale to population level or to national level. So this is a project that was built by our team in Kenya, including David, who's actually I see on the webinar, so you can direct questions directly to him. And it was in response to a very real kind of need in Kenya in the 2013 elections, where government released that they had rechanged the boundaries of where people needed to register to vote. It was a very fiercely contested election, but the only way that people could realistically get this information was either to go into a government office physically to find out where they needed to register, or to download a massive file from government servers as a big PDF, and then trawl through these scores and scores of pages to try and find out where your specific registration station is. David and a colleague, a data fellow, worked for a day and a half scraping that information, building a very simple web portal, and later on an SMS kind of tool that allowed people to find out where to register, what information to take with them, and what the process was. That initiative went viral. They had over 2,000 hits on the site within the first hour and a half of it being live, and it just grew from there on. The project was so successful that they then expanded the number of functions and services that this was able to do, including introducing a feedback loop. So not just pushing information at people, but allowing people to also then use that information to do something constructive. And this is a very important principle in all of the work that we do. So in this case, it allowed people to send peace messages to politicians or to other community leaders who were deemed to be responsible for a lot of inflammatory kind of public comments that people were scared were going to lead to violence in the elections. The project worked so well that it was then replicated by volunteers in Zimbabwe, and later on with a coalition of civil society partners, the election authorities in Malawi actually adopted something that had started out as a newsroom civil society project, and they adopted it as the government solution in Malawi for the elections in May this year for voter verification. So in other words, you could use this tool to verify whether you were registered and where you were registered, and if there were any errors, you were able to report these. The electoral authority claims that between 300 and 400 people used this service. It was the extended functionality was only built for $10,000. So it proves that national level, highly impactful tools can be built for very affordable amounts of money. Al Jazeera did a really neat video showing how this impacted on people living in deep, deep rural areas, and how it saved them from having to make day-long trips into government offices to find the information. The back end of that tool was exactly as you see on the screen, incredibly simple. It was simply a spreadsheet that we uploaded to Google Fusion Tables, and we cleaned the information and used this to power a variety of tools. And again, this is a hallmark of a lot of the projects that we do. We try and build incredibly simple solutions, and that's so that they can be replicated as quickly and as cheaply as possible, but also so that we as technologists don't get seduced by kind of razzmatazz and the bling of what's possible using a lot of this gadgetry. Here's another quick example from Malawi. This is in partnership with a large blue-collar newspaper, and effectively those three tools you see at the top of the web page there allows ordinary citizens to find out whether their doctors are in fact real doctors, if they're really registered, if they've got any malpractice cases against them or anything else. It's accessible both via the website and via SMS, so you're dealing with people who don't have access to the web, and all you do is enter the doctor's name and it gives you back some information. It also provides similar info services for helping you figure out if the medicine or the treatment you've been prescribed is covered by your national health insurance, and then also how to find a doctor. So very practical, very useful kind of info services, all data-driven for citizens. Again, the back end, simple spreadsheets on Google Fusion Tables. Where do we get this information? We don't just conjure it out of the air. In this case, in the Kenyan case, we actually scraped it off a government agency website where the information was publicly available, but so difficult to find and so difficult to search and personalize that no members of the public actually used it. And another principle that we try and then build into as many of our projects as possible is, again, the feedback loop. So we're not just taking information from government agencies and giving it to citizens. We're also then allowing both the doctors as well as the users, the citizens themselves, to help verify whether this information is accurate. And that's because government deals with such massive volumes of information that it's often dirty. So in this case, people are able to flag any inaccuracies on doctors' details, and we then feed that back to the authority so that they can then update their information, and it creates something of a virtuous cycle. Here's another very quick example using the same principle in 14 Southern African countries. This one was built by the Code for South Africa team down in Cape Town. And what it does is analyzes pharmaceutical purchases by governments across that region to make sure that pharmaceutical companies are not doing any price gouging where they're overcharging countries who potentially are not as good as negotiating as some of their colleagues. And the tool has helped identify, in the case of Botswana, potential savings of $10 million in procurement from 2 or 3 pharmaceutical companies. That information is then used by governments to then go back into negotiation and try and recover some of that overcharging. We've taken and flipped that tool. So the first version of that tool was built for governments. We then said, well, this has been so powerful and the data is so useful, how can we repurpose that so that ordinary citizens can use it? And in South Africa, what we've done is, where there's legislated price guidelines on medicines, we've then created a Mobi app and info service that helps people figure out if their pharmacists are charging them the prescribed price. Often they actually get overcharged. So all you do is type in the name of the medicine or you scan the barcode and it gives you back information. More importantly, it also helps you find generic drugs. So even when you prescribe a name brand drug, it helps you find something that's potentially a lot easier. An amusing story is that the site or service went down for a couple of days 2 weeks ago, and the very first people who complained were actually doctors. So it turns out that doctors were using the service to help find generic alternatives to the medicines that they intended prescribing. But having tools is just one step of this process. You need to make sure that the investment that you put into scraping and cleaning all of this data isn't just a one-shot wonder. It doesn't just get used on one project. So for as many of our projects as possible, we then package this information for third-party reuse free of charge. This is the example from the Code for South Africa website, where they've built APIs on medicines, elections, geospatial and political data for people to reuse. A final example to just demonstrate 2 other principles is one from Ghana. This is a demonstration project. So this is something in the labs that hasn't yet been deployed at scale yet. But in Ghana, extractive or mining companies have to pay back 3% of the revenues that they realize from mining on land to the communities who've been impacted. And we've built a tool that helps people at a village and at a regional level track how much money is owed to them and then what government has actually done with those royalties. The initial complaints were from everyone, and the perception was that mining companies were systematically underpaying what they owed. The reality, once we looked at the data, was that they were overpaying, but that government, for a number of structural reasons, was struggling to use that money to build the infrastructure that they had intended to. So what we did was, again, rather than just pushing information at people, we've consciously built a number of tools that you'll see on the bottom of that slide that helps people to do something with the information they've now received. In this case, they could petition everyone involved, government officials, mining companies, their local authorities, and demand some kind of action. They could connect with others in their village or their region who are interested in this information, and then they could register for updates. And that's incredibly important as a principle. You need to create tools that empower communities. And then now, just very quickly, some additional tools as examples of what is possible using information that is readily available either in a country you're working in and how you can repurpose that for local reuse, or if it's available internationally and you try and localize it. Here we've taken a whole swath of economic and census data, and we've created a very, very simple visual-driven interface to help people understand not just the country and the region they live in, but right down to the street level information of who their neighbors are, how they're employed, what the demographics are, and so forth. There's a working example for South Africa with embeddable, and then they could register for updates. And that's incredibly important as a principle. You need to create tools that empower communities. And then now, just very quickly, some additional tools as examples of what is possible using information that is readily available either in a country you're working in and how you can repurpose that for local reuse, or if it's available internationally and you try and localize it. Here we've taken a whole swath of economic and census data, and we've created a very, very simple visual-driven interface to help people understand not just the country and the region they live in, but right down to the street level information of who their neighbors are, how they're employed, what the demographics, and so forth. Working example for South Africa with embeddable widgets and tools that come with it, and we're busy building similar ones for Ghana and Kenya at the moment. Where data doesn't exist, we've partnered with governments to help them actually digitize data. This is an example of a project in South Africa where we're digitizing for the first time bylaws going back hundreds or 150 years in many cases. So we're turning them into machine readable data that people can then build services on top. Everything from planning permission apps to advisory apps on, there's a guerrilla gardening group that uses this information to figure out where they can plant public gardens without breaking the laws in Cape Town. But more importantly, it gives us the opportunity to bring together or layer multiple sets of data, one on top of the other. And this is an example, again, a demo example that we're busy testing at the moment in Cape Town that pulls together budget data, political data that we scrape out of Parliament, and then municipal data from their live proceedings to help show who is your ward representative and what money they're spending and planning in your specific street, so that what you can do is influence how your tax resources are being spent. Again, the intention or the purpose here is to empower the people that we work with. We use three principles in all these projects. Firstly, all of the projects that we build have to be citizen-focused, which means that we can't plan and design for elites. We can't go and say, well, we're partnering with the World Bank or we're partnering with a large media company. What do they want to build? We rather go out and we find out what the pain points are in ordinary people's lives, which brings us to the second principle. We insist that not just are our projects citizen-focused, they've got to be demand-driven. So the question we ask is, what keeps you awake at night? What is the thing that really kind of puts the fear of God in you about keeping your family fed, about keeping your kids safe? And then we try and figure out if we can use data to help solve or kind of address that challenge in people's lives. And the final principle is that everything we do needs to be action orientated. It needs to be outcomes based. And the reason for that is that too often a lot of resources are put into just informing people without thinking about how would they take the next step to do something about what they now know. So that's very ambitious, and it's very impossible for any of our organizations to do that on our own. So we've been fairly aggressive in terms of building communities to help us. And one of the forms that we use is Hacks and Hackers. They're a voluntary civic technology kind of community. They're global. We've helped seed 16 chapters across Africa, and there are currently over 31,000 active people in that chapter. So largely virtual a community at least. It crosses national and regional boundaries, language boundaries, religious boundaries, and you certainly get people collaborating on very similar projects because the challenges, the developmental challenges that people face are so similar across the continent. A lot of African data is still locked up in dead wood, in documentation. So we build backbone projects which try and digitize and then turn digital information into structured data as widely as possible across Africa. And that's everything from universities and systems through to parliaments and so forth. Everything we do, we try and put an API on the back end. So we try and avoid building portals or catalogs. We rather try and build an API that people can simply plug into to reuse as easily as possible. That said, we do actually have a portal, and we're looking at improving that at the moment. It's driven by volunteers. This is an old screenshot. It's actually got about 1,400 data sets in it at the moment. And these are data sets that we've had to scrape, so they're data that no people can't find elsewhere. And then all of that is great, but it's simply inventory. You need to actually have real people. So we've got a very active program across the continent which goes out and gives people skills, connects people with others with similar passions, and then gives them the resources and the tools so that they can build real kind of solutions. And that ranges from the traditional hackathons, which we try and avoid, and kind of primarily is rather more face-to-face, smaller group engagements driven around concrete projects. We also have embedded fellow programs, and David started as one of our embedded fellows and is now a lead technologist for a major part of our work across Africa. So we create career paths for people interested in civic kind of projects. We also build a lot of resources. So here are some examples of some of the online reference books as well as online mass courses they've done. And then also we're collaborating on building a commons, which brings together code, skills, data, as well as best practices. And what we also do in Africa, which might be slightly different to what some of our colleagues are doing, is also then bring money to those communities so people can actually do something with their great ideas. We've created with colleagues in Europe and elsewhere something called civic patterns, which tries to reduce or boil down some of the core lessons that not just us, but others in Latin America, Europe, and the US have learned. So that's a useful place for you to go and have a look as well. Here's a quick overview of some of the kind of lessons that we've learned. None of this is rocket science. A lot of it is common sense. So if you have a quick look through those
Thank
lessons,
you very much, Justin and
a lot of
Matthew.
it is about being
Justin, if you could connect your camera, I think it got disconnected at some point during your presentation. This is so people can see you.
That you're addressing.
Lots
of geographies, lots of distances.
I would encourage now people, if they have questions, to go ahead and type them. For the moment, we have one. This is from Gaius Kowene, currently working in Amsterdam, but originally from Congo, and this is for Justin. So the question is, sorry, I can't read it right now. Where is it? No, because it's up there. Farther up. Yeah, so the question is, Justin, in most African countries, only few people have access to internet, and that at very bad quality, so no broadband. Are there specific tips or alternatives you would like to share with us to make sure this challenge doesn't slow or block people's actions in open data?
Yes, so I mean, I think that's a very common concern and potentially a hurdle and I think it's more of a mental hurdle, because the reality is that data itself is not the product or the solution that we try and get people to use. You use open data to solve a problem, and the resulting tool can be very lightweight. So if you look at something like Got to Vote, for example, that was something that worked on SMS and can work on WhatsApp and other chat tools, so even cheaper than SMS. So you don't have to have full access to broadband internet to be able to benefit from open data. Many of the media we work with actually present the results of their open data work in print or in radio, where you cannot show people visualizations or you can't get them to engage with the data. And what they do is they rather use that data for deep analysis and for localization. In fact, what a lot of our media partners
to share on
do
that same
is
point,
that they
because I
use
know
this
in
data
certain parts,
to be able to
rural areas in
localize
the
a story. So
Caribbean,
they can
there is
explain
the
a
same
very
challenge.
high-level issue to
I
people,
would
and then
reiterate a
they
lot of
say,
the points
here
that
is a
Justin
simple
just
tool,
made. I mean, I
simply using
think,
SMS
even
to
as we
find
do
out what
things
this
like
very
build
high-level education story
APIs and
means in
build
your village
open
and in
data portals
your
and
life
those type of things,
specifically.
that really
So it's a
forms the
very good
backbone.
way for
And so
personalizing
even with
information.
Harvest, the problem on the government side that we were trying to address was breaking down those silos that prevented different organizations within government from accessing that information. But then what that led to is now the ability to really, that was infrastructure, but that led to us being now able to create kind of citizen facing services that that is what what people interface with. And so right now, we're just working with and I didn't mention it's working with the CTA. There are a number of different around helping farmers connect with buyers, but then using, one of the organizations that's interested in using this data is now looking at, well, how do I know if a farmer is registered or not? Or how do I help to authenticate to see if someone is actually a part of the system? Or how do you help them get registered? And so, even though an API, for example, is something that's very intangible to the average person, we're now looking at building services on top of that that affect people's lives, that connect with, so they interact with those services, but then those services are powered by information that we're helping to liberate, as an example.
Justin, I have myself a question for you. It's actually two questions. One is you mentioned the four Code for movements around the world, and this is probably also a question for Matthew. And that is, how do you guys coordinate or share experiences? How do you guys differ from each other or are similar to each other? So I would first ask Justin to answer, and then Matthew.
He's muted. You're muted,
You're
Justin.
muted, Justin. Just a second. We're trying to figure out what's going on. We can't hear you.
Oh, you're back.
Now you can hear you. Go ahead.
Cool. So like all nascent movements, we first had to find ourselves. We had to find out what commonalities and what shared values we did share. Code for America, which shares a very similar name to a Code for Africa, has a very different approach. They work almost purely with governments in the past, where we work almost entirely with civil societies. So it's almost diametrically opposed. But over the past 18 months, there's been quite intense discussion between us. We've got together a couple of times. This includes folk from the Caribbean, Latin America, Pakistan, India, Europe, and the US. And we found that although our approaches might be slightly different, the challenges that we're trying to solve and tackle are incredibly similar. So what's happened now is that we've come together and started a more in-depth kind of nuanced discussion through something called Code for All, which is initially coordinated by the Code for America initiative and supported by Google, Media, and a number of other organizations. But other than outside of that, there are a lot of bilateral collaborations that happen. So we are working with Code for Europe, for example, testing ideas around creating a commons. We work extensively with people in Latin America and India, building tools together. And actually, we're busy discussing with Matthew in the Caribbean and with the Mexicans a way of streamlining and building some of this big infrastructure like data portals, building them together to keep costs down as much as possible. So we spend as little money as possible on some of the shared infrastructure and save our resources for actually connecting with citizens and doing real work.
Thank you, Justin. Matthew, would you care to share your views on this topic?
I mean, yeah, I think Justin touched a lot of those different points. We were one of the founding partners in Code for All, and I think that idea, I mean, certainly from our point of view, this idea of how do you create kind of shared experience, but also recognizing the differences and approaches has been super valuable. And I think initially it started there in just sharing knowledge. I think now where we see a lot of the kind of collaboration going is not just, yes, through the network. Hello? Sorry about that. Technology. Yeah, so just thinking, well, what are shared metrics for success? What are tools that we can collaborate on? What are tools that we can reuse across networks to really help to bring the costs down? I mean, investing in public goods that each of us can leverage are really where I see some of the collaboration now emerging and kind of transitioning towards.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Nirad Pudasaini. Sorry, and Justin, maybe you can go ahead and answer first. How do you recognize the demands from the citizen side? Is there a certain process that you follow to recognize these demands?
So our movement is slightly different in that we were born out of the media industry. So the mass media in Africa actually kickstarted this open data movement here, not government and not civil society. And the reason they did that was because they have a long tradition of being or viewing themselves as the champions and the voices of ordinary citizens. But the reality is that often as they corporatize, they've lost that real connection with citizens. And the open data movement was one way that they were looking at reinvigorating citizen engagement and citizen consultation. So what we do is we work through mass media. We also work through mass citizen movements. And it's important to distinguish that these are different from NGOs. So we go to women's societies, churches, labor unions. We go and we send some of our project workers in to stand in the queues at clinics and at schools. And we talk to people. The only way you really find out what citizens need is actually spending time on the ground with citizens. Otherwise, it becomes so academic that you end up building a tool that the donors and the large kind of multinational institutions get excited about, and no one ends up using. So in a nutshell, our quick answer is you need to keep the process as transparent and as kind of tangible as possible. And the only way to do that is to sit face to face with the communities that you're supposedly working with, and with them work through what the real issues are. You might go there wanting to solve malaria when in fact the real issue is access to clean water. Figuring out what their real needs are, their primary needs, and then figuring out if there's a way that the work that we do can solve it. Sometimes technology and data is not the route to a solution, and we need to be able to kind of accept that and move on and potentially connect people to more appropriate solution providers. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that you really need to spend time in the field, which is why it's important that you don't parachute in and out, that you have deep local structures and local ownership.
Thank you, Justin. I'll give now Matthew the floor, and after this we'll be closing. Matthew?
I think Justin covered all the stuff on the community side. I think the other thing I would add, I think, is maybe on the government or institutional side, that sometimes there's this, we talk about as the other, especially in the open government community, as government not being transparent enough, or government not opening information, or we criticize the ways in which data is clean or not clean, or all of those things. And I think in that case, it's also key to spend time on that side, because I think there's lots of friction, there are lots of constraints that sometimes a lot of government agencies or persons who work within government are aware of, but aren't necessarily don't know how to address them. And so, in the same way that we think about how do we be responsive to some of those things, we'd also be how do we create technology that can help government be responsive to citizens as well as be responsive to the services that they have to provide. And that also involves spending time in government agencies, in understanding the constraints around having 150 extension officers and 800,000 farmers. It's very easy to say, agencies aren't, why haven't I seen my extension officer in 4 years? But when you really dig down and you say, there's some real challenges that some of these agencies have to face. And so helping to create empathy on that side as well is really key. And then looking at, how do you open up that problem space that other people can engage and participate and support, as well as how do people on the ground and citizens also provide feedback, I think is a really key to building a healthy ecosystem as well.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry. Can we have your title? Yeah. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating today. Before giving the floor to Matthew and Justin for the closing remarks, I would like to remind the audience that this webinar will be published on the website in 24 hours. And I would like to invite everybody to the next webinar, which will be on e-government for cities, developing the back office of the technology city on December 17th. And information on this upcoming webinar can be found on the E-Institute website. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Matthew now for his closing remarks.
I mean, I will be quite quick. I think a lot of the points that were made already. In thinking about the ecosystem, I think we have to recognize the ecosystem is made up of a lot of different partners. And oftentimes there are real constraints in terms of that prevent agencies on the government side from being able to participate. Open data, if it's going to be sustainable, or building an open data ecosystem, if it's going to be sustainable, it has to be aligned with the services that people are providing and their responsibilities on a day-to-day basis. If it's going to be something that's different or something additional, then that's not going to stick. And so we have to, as a community, we have to also think about how do we align those things as well on the institutional side. I suppose Justin will touch on the community side from his work as well.
So my closing remarks are exactly, I think Matthew again, I think the first speaker always gets kind of choice of saying all the real good things. So Matthew, you beat me to the punch there on a lot of it. I think the one thing that often we don't look at and we sometimes neglect is that government isn't the only repository of data. And that what we need to start doing is also understanding that we need to start liberating data in our universities and in civil society, as well as in citizens themselves. A lot of this data helps kind of contextualize and personalize and localize this very high-level stuff that we're getting from governments. So an education data set or a water point data set is far more meaningful when we understand how that intersects with real people's lives. And the moment we start doing that, it means that we can start building far more valuable tool sets. And the only way that's going to happen is by starting to match supply with demand. So it sounds like a cliche, but it's incredible how often we get that wrong in the field. We'd be very keen to help experiment with this. So I think the other thing that I'd like to say is that experiments can happen quickly, cheaply, and we only really need to start worrying about scaling or about cost once you find something that really works well.
Well, thank you very much again, everybody, and we hope to see you again in our next webinar. Good night, good afternoon, and good morning again.
Thank you.
Thank you.